So, on aggregate times, the Chepex were quickest and would start first on the road on day 2. With the top special and production vehicles well mixed up in the top 10, the lines were drawn for an intriguing battle over the next 2 days. Off-roaders believe in the early bird adage, and before the start of Racing Section 2, the atmosphere was friendly, if somewhat tense. Also present, His Majesty King Letsie III of Lesotho.
Many of us look forward to the rally every year, and we are delighted and very, very happy that for 33 years this event has been taking place in our country. It is a great source of pride and joy for us, not only here in Maseru but throughout the country, and it places on the international map.
Racing Section 2 consisted of 2 loops over roughly 500 kilometres east of Maseru, with a service point at the end of each loop. Franz Čepek felt upbeat.
It's quite nice to be out in front because you're not going to suffer with the dust, but then again you're going to suffer with route finding, which is quite difficult, you know, because it's quite difficult to mark here in Lesotho, and but hopefully we'll find the route and hopefully we'll stay in front.
Behind the Chepex, Api Reiniger knew what he had to do.
The roof is a very dangerous place, and we're doing the same route tomorrow, so we'll take it easy today and see what's the route like, so that we don't end it up in one of these dongas.
Echoing Reiniger's sentiments, John Weir-Smith.
I think today we just need to take it fairly easy. It's a long way, it's very, very rough out there. We had a bit of a good run yesterday, and there are quite a few dangerous holes and cliffs and that sort of thing out there. So I think take it fairly easy and just keep it on the road.
And Hannes Grobler.
It's a long way. I mean, it's still 1,000 kilos. It's probably only going to start tomorrow morning, you know, so we're happy if we can be at the same place tonight. We'll be happy, and then from tomorrow we'll take it on, see if we can make it.
1,000 kilometres still ahead indeed, but the one thing that had not been thrown into the mixture yet was the weather. Dry, if somewhat dusty conditions greeted the competitors as they got down to the serious business of racing. Franz Čepek Sr. and Jr. had not had a good season at all and held a slender 18-second lead over the Reiniger-Houghton combination at the start of Racing Section 2. The multiple former champions had also suffered from reliability problems throughout the season, but things were looking better. Weir-Smith and Minutes in the Dark Dog Porsche Raceco started at a steady pace, as did Grobler and Leek in the impressive BP Nissan Hardbody. With less than a minute between each of the top crews on the road, the dust was turning out to be a bit of a problem. The starting order hadn't changed as Greg and Fred Dowse in their Porsche Raceco maintained 5th position. It was still early days. Having started a mere 17 seconds behind class champions Variawa and Carolyn, Bevan Berthold and Atang Makakaneni in their Speedstick Raceco were pushing as hard as conditions allowed. Often competitors were literally within touching distance of each other, but the rocky surface and the dust made passing difficult. It was still way too early to get adventurous, so Dowse and Variawa were treading carefully. Despite a stomach bug, which would later put him out of the event, Arthur Abraham and his son Scott were going strong in their Jeep Cherokee, maintaining 8th on the road. Up to 9th on the road, Mark Corbett and Juan Moore in their Jimco, who had 1 class win under their belt this season. They were looking for a good result to challenge for 2nd in the class championship and had already passed John Moore and his Miller Moore Honda Racing Y2K Fishbowl. That's horsepower of a different kind as we catch up with the field halfway through the first loop. Still leading, both overall and in Class A, Franz Čepek Sr. and Jr. in the Epson V Motors Chenoweth. Class B leader Giel Nel, who already had a finishing record of 4 class wins, a 2nd and a 3rd, in 7 starts this year. The little Trussie with its Golf engine was looking virtually spotless and sounding smooth as Nel negotiated his way over and through the obstacles in his path. In Class D, Chaniel de Villiers and Pete Swanepoel in the BP Nissan Hardbody were maintaining their class lead, secure in the knowledge that they didn't have to push too hard, as class champions Hein Grobler and Charles Volmerats were still way down the order. Leading Class E were the brothers Birkin in their Toyota Hilux. They had already passed Jean-Pierre Joubert and Errol Hodgson on the road and were opening up a gap over their title rivals, Noel and Robin Quinn, in their Pajero. Still at the front of the super trucks were Arpi Reiniger and Robin Houghton in the Castrol Toyota Land Cruiser. Their third place in the recent Caledon 400 had given them hope that at last their reliability problems were over. The Chepex and their Epson V Motors Chenoweth accelerated out of the first service point, still leading both overall and in their class. No problems for them, while the Reiniger-Houghton combination had suffered from some punctures. For most competitors, it was a welcome break, while their service crews jumped into action to carry out the necessary repairs. We'll have in the second loop with Franz Chepex Senior and Junior still leading Class A. The Epson V Motors Chenoweth had run without missing a beat, and the crew were driving with great confidence. Up to second in Class A now were Mark Corbett and Juan Moore in their Jimco, having started fifth at the beginning of Racing Section 2. They had taken advantage of various problems suffered by their class rivals and were looking solid. Up to third from fourth in Class A were Bevan Berthold and Atang Mahakaneni in the Speedstick Racing Raceco, who'd overtaken Greg and Fred Dowse in their Porsche Raceco. While they were pushing hard, Richard Schilling had joined the ranks of the spectators after he and Ashley Thorne had retired from the race. Still going strong and leading Class B, the ever-consistent Heel Nell in his home-built Golf-driven Trussie. He was ahead of Francois Smith and Nick Clarkson in their Sandmaster, and Archie Sally and Peter Ferreira also in a Sandmaster. A change on the road in Class D, with Pete Haasbroek from Freiburg and Christo Bosch in their Toyota Land Cruiser now in the lead. They'd gone past early leaders De Villiers and Swanepoel, as well as Nars LaRue and Cornel Jonker in the Colt Rodeo, the rough terrain causing all kinds of problems. As always, the local spectators shouted all the necessary encouragement. The De Villiers-Swanepoel combination in the BP Nissan Hardbody had lost some time due to problems like punctures, but were still holding down second place in Class D. LaRue and Jonker had also lost time and were running third on the road, but everybody knew that there was still a long way to go and that anything could still happen. Even so, they were trying to regain some time. The Birkins were still driving a steady race in their Toyota Hilux, leading Class E for standard production vehicles. If they could hold on to this position, they would take this year's Class E championship. But it had started raining some 120 kilometers from the end, and the surface was getting slippery at places. Up into second position in Class E now were the main title rivals, Noel and Robin Quinn, in their Mitsubishi Pajero, who'd started the day with a deficit of some 2.5 minutes on the Birkin brothers. This battle was far from over. Down to third in class were Jean-Pierre Joubert and Errol Hodgson in the Char Lynn Freight Toyota TDI. Arpi Reiniger and Robin Houghton were still comfortably in the lead in Class T in their Castrol Toyota Land Cruiser. Apart from the odd puncture, the pair had suffered no serious problems and were looking strong. Behind them on the road, however, were Cliff Barker and Vic Kampfer in the Land Rover, who'd been forced to fight their way up the order from the back of the field after losing a wheel in the time trial the previous day. Down to third in Class T were Hannes Krobler and Richard Leake in the BP Nissan Hardbody, who'd lost more than an hour after getting stuck in a ditch. Fortunately, they didn't suffer any serious damage, and they could set out to make up the lost time. Although the sun was still shining on various parts of the route, the clouds were gathering, threatening heavy overnight rain. At the end of day two, Franz Chepex Senior and Junior topped the results sheet ahead of Corbett and Moore, with Berthold and Mahakaneni leading Reiniger and Houghton.
The weather's going to be a problem today. We didn't expect this. The rain was only supposed to come this afternoon, but it looks like we're going to drive into the rain, which is very bad for the specials because, you know, we can't see. All the wheels throwing up mud. There's no fenders. Rain comes in, mud comes in.
Following exactly the same route as the previous day, the Epson V Motors Chenoweth led the way in extremely muddy conditions. The competitors started in the order and with the time gaps set on the previous day, and they knew that a very difficult time lay ahead. Berthold and Mahakaneni followed Corbett and Moore, making a very gingerly start. Behind them, Arpi Reiniger and Robin Houghton leading the production vehicle category.
In this type of weather, you can slide into one of these dangas or into a river, get stuck, and all sorts of things. So it would be endurance to get through today. And our plan was to keep our heads together and say that we can get the car to the end of the race. If we can do that without delay, we have a chance to win this race today.
Well, no gingerly start for them as the Castrol Toyota Land Cruiser sped away. But at the front of the field, the Czepek combination, here still going strong, would be the first major retirement of the day. The overnight rain had swollen many of the rivers on the route, which added another danger to the already slippery surface. The Czepeks would succumb to electrical failure. Corbett and Moore slid their Jimco out of control into a ditch, where it would stay for at least 10 minutes, despite the enthusiastic help of some of the bystanders. Not even the knobbly off-road tyres could give enough grip for the vehicle to be pulled out of the relatively shallow ditch, which was an indication of the perils faced by the competitors on the third day of this year's Pirelli Lesotho Sun Roof of Africa. And it wasn't only the vehicles that struggled for grip on the muddy, gooey surface. Poor old Juan Moore looked like a first-time ice skater as he tried to get back to his vehicle. Out on the road, production vehicle leaders Reinicker and Houghton had passed Bevan Berthold and Atang Makakhaneni as conditions continued to get worse. Many rivers had swallowed to such a level that it was downright dangerous for competitors to attempt to cross them. Greg Harvey and Boy Stone in their Castrol-backed Jimco were also treading carefully. They were looking for a good result to consolidate their second place in the Class A Championship. Andrew and Chris Birkin were still holding on to their overnight lead in Class E, knowing that nothing less than a class victory in their Toyota Hilux would ensure them that class title that they'd fought so hard for during the season. Despite the desperately tricky conditions, they couldn't back down for a second, while at the same time an accident would be a disaster. Behind them, Chaniel de Villiers and Pete Swanepoel in the Class D BP Nissan Hardbody were making good progress. They were second in class overnight, but had started some 10 minutes behind the Class E leaders and were catching up rapidly. In the Class D battle, de Villiers and Swanepoel were trying to close the gap of just more than 11 minutes that they were down on Haasbroek and Bosch in their Toyota Land Cruiser. Unfortunately for the Class D leaders, the conditions would catch up with them later, and they would lose almost 25 minutes to drop to third in class. Probler and Leek, third overnight in Class T in their BP Nissan Hardbody, could only hope that conditions would catch out the Reinicker Houghton and Barker-Kampfer combinations ahead of them, as they had a massive deficit to make up after their problems of the previous day. On many stretches of the course, the vehicles bunched up in order to help each other out of the mud should they get stuck, and windscreens misting up from the heat inside the cabin added to the problems. Noel and Robin Quinn were trailing the Birkins by about 25 minutes overnight in their Class E battle, and were also hoping to get to the finish. Barker and Kampfer in their Land Rover would strike trouble before the end of the race, just another in the long list of retirements. Not so for the Woolrich-Schulthammer pairing in the Ford Racing Ford Ranger, who drove consistently well and would finish 9th overall and 3rd in Class E. LaRue and Jonker would take Class D in the Colt Rodeo. While Kutsia Labaskachny and Pete Hirnes would finish in their Class E Toyota Hilux, the same could unfortunately not be said about Heel Nell and his Golf Trussie. Electrical problems due to excessive moisture were the cause of most of the retirements. A sorry sight as early leaders Franz Czepek Sr. and Jr. are towed by Harvey and Stone. The Epson V Motors Chenoweth had succumbed to electrical failure. As the weary drivers, co-drivers and vehicles that were left entered the service point at the end of the first loop, it became clear that it would be too dangerous to run the second loop as planned. Most of the rivers had flooded and it would be too dangerous, so the clerk of the course decided to cancel that part of the race and to run the first loop a second time. By now, the field had been thinned down to just a handful of vehicles, with Arby Reinicker and Robin Housen leading overall in their Class T Castrol Toyota Land Cruiser. With even them struggling in the powerful 4x4, it was anybody's guess as to the final outcome of one of the most difficult Roof of Africa events in recent memory. Mark Corbett and Juan Moore had driven a magnificent race in their Jimco to move up to second place on the road, with the pair seemingly oblivious of the problems bedeviling the rest of the field. Having already taken 2 class victories this season, a third one was definitely looking on the cards. Then drama struck as race leaders Reiniger and Houghton were crawling along at snail's pace, just 8 kilometers from the end. The Castrol Toyota Land Cruiser had struck a rock while crossing a river, causing serious damage to the left front suspension. They had wedged a large stone in between the suspension components to keep the vehicle balanced and crawled over the finish line, having given up the lead to the Jimco. This was a dramatic end to a dramatic race, and the Land Cruiser pair's dogged determination to finish epitomized the true spirit of off-road racing, and they were greeted with loud approval from the crowd at the finish. Reiniger and Houghton did enough to win the production vehicle category, although these results are still subject to confirmation due to protests after the clerk of the course's earlier decision. Mark Corbett and Juan Moore were ecstatic with their first overall and special vehicle victory in a field that was decimated by the adverse conditions. Theirs was the only special vehicle among the classified finishers.
Special vehicles don't really race production vehicles, but it is good to be the first car home, first vehicle home. Yeah.
I would say it was a very difficult day. You know, we had to cross about 25 times the river, and every time we get out of the vehicle, walk through the river, see how deep it is, feel where the rocks is to get on top of the rocks, because if you end up in the loose sand, you get stuck. And also getting up the mountains with all the mud.
Lesotho Sun, Roof of Africa.